Open up your Bibles today to Genesis chapter 25. Genesis 25. We're starting a new series today called Naming Rights. A look at the life of Jacob. In Genesis 25, we're going to start down at verse 19. Or if you're tech savvy and using the Bible app, the YouVersion Bible app, all this morning's notes and scripture are there under live events. You can find all that there. You know, there was a young man back in the 80s, actually. He got a finance degree, got out of college, had this degree, started a brokerage firm, actually became so successful, he was one of the top brokerage agents. He was named one of the youngest to be a part of this special group that were very successful. He had acquired much in his work. But in the process, one of his creditors was sold to another much larger bank who called some of his loans into question. And they asked him to pay back a big chunk of them within the next 90 days for his business. And that was going to amount to about $1.2 million. And obviously he did not have that. He wasn't anywhere near having that. And so he went bankrupt in the process of trying to pay this back and filing for bankruptcy, trying to use some of his personal money to pay off some of his business stuff, and he was financially ruined for a period of time. But as he did that, he became more actively involved in his church. He was a Christian, was a believer, and he turned to God in his moment of great trial. And as he became more actively involved in his church and grew more mature spiritually, he began to counsel some of the young couples, he and his wife, some of the young couples in that church, and began to kind of rebuild their family financially in the midst of this process. And he studied a lot during this, and he developed a system of lessons and practices that he began to teach to people on a financial counselor's aspect. And he began to teach these, and some of his clients, after about a few years, 5, 6, 7 years, began to ask him, you need to put this in writing so that other people can benefit from this, not just us. And so he wrote a book with these financial principles that he came up with, along with a few other guys. And that book went straight up to the New York Times bestseller list. It was called Financial Peace, and the man's name was Dave Ramsey. From the pits of financial ruin, God was still able to use him and do something great with him. In the midst of the pit of where his finances were, many people would have looked at where he was at that time and said, you don't need to be in finances whatsoever, because obviously you have no idea what you're doing. But God was still able to use him as he was willing to be used. And that's what we're going to see today here at the end of Genesis 25 and the first part of Genesis 26, that even though there are things in all of our pasts that may limit us potentially, at least in the eyes of others, God still has a purpose for us in his intended future. At this point in biblical history, Abraham has been promised by God that one of his descendants will bring about the salvation of the world. Every human being on the planet will be blessed because of one of Abraham's descendants. And God gives Abraham the son who will continue that line and that blessing, and that would be his son Isaac. And he says that blessing is going to come through Isaac's descendants. And so Isaac goes on, and he, at this point, he goes through his 20s, and he's not married, goes through his 30s, and is not married. But he knows God still has a purpose. God's plan is still for the line of salvation for the world to come through him. And so God brings about his marriage when he is 40 years old. Look at verses 19, 20, and 21. It says, these are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham fathered Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Padan Aram, the sister of Laban, the Aramean, to be his wife. And Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. Now, what we see here is the beginning of a great testimony of faith. Abraham had been chosen by God to be the beginning of his rescue plan for humanity. Abraham was a God follower, and from his descendants would come the Son of God who would die and raise and give everyone on the earth who would believe the opportunity of heaven. And Abraham, though, even though God chose to use him, Abraham was just as flawed as any one of us. He was selfish at times. He was impatient at times. He was a coward at times. And he was a doubter at times. And yet still God chose to use him because he was willing to be used. We find out earlier in the book of Genesis 15:6, that Abraham was actually declared righteous before God because of the faith he demonstrated in following after God. So Abraham demonstrated that faith, and that faith was then adopted by his son Isaac, though with one key difference. If you know the story of Abraham, it's very similar to the story of Isaac here. Both Abraham and Isaac's wives were unable to have children. But the way they responded to that situation is completely different. Abraham tried to take the situation in his own hands and created a terrible situation. Created generations of conflict that would go on for thousands of years, all because instead of turning to God, he tried to do it on his own. Well, as we see there in that verse, verse 21, Isaac responded in a completely different way. Isaac responded with prayer. And God answered Isaac's faith in his prayer in the affirmative. His wife Rebekah becomes pregnant, and his faith is justified. But the pregnancy is not an easy one. Look at verse 22. It says, "The children struggled together within her, and she said, 'If it is thus, why is this happening to me?' So she went to inquire of the Lord." Now, there's no ultrasounds in that day and time. There's only experience and gut feelings. And there's great turmoil in Rebekah's womb. And then there's that phrase there that says, "The children struggled together within her." And that phrase literally means they came to blows. They were striking each other. They were smashing each other. And at this point, she has no way of knowing that she definitely has twins. All that she knows is her insides are going crazy right now. Imagine two men who can't stand each other being shoved in a confined space for 9 months. It will not turn out very well. And that's what's going on inside of Rebekah. And so Rebekah's experiencing this, but undoubtedly the wild actions going on in her womb are causing her great anxiety as she's worried about this. I mean, any mom today would be anxious if this kind of thing were going on. But in that day and time, when you can't run to the doctor and have them do all kinds of tests and do an ultrasound to make sure everything's okay, it's even more chaotic because there's no way you're going to know what is going on at all. And so you've got Rebekah with all this going on, and she asks the question that many a mother has uttered before: why is this happening to me? She's confused, she's anxious, but she, like her husband, turns to the one person who has the answer. She turns to God. Verse 23. "And the Lord said to her, 'Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger.'" So God gives Rebekah a great glimpse at what is to come. He answers her prayer specifically. He says, "You've got two children inside of you. Each of their descendants will become so numerous that they will become nations among themselves." And the fighting that they're doing right now inside of Rebekah will just be the beginning, as those two nations one day in the future will be at odds, will be enemies of each other. One of the nations will be naturally stronger than the other, though it will not be as is naturally assumed in this culture. The last line there, when it says the older will serve the younger, that shrugs off cultural convention and says that the nation of the younger son will be greater than the nation of the older son. The older son was supposed to be greater, according to the thinking of the day. And we know from Genesis 32 and 33 that the older son was, in fact, stronger. But in spite of this fact, the nation of the younger son will be greater. And that's solely because from his descendants will come the Son of God, who will save the world and give them the opportunity of heaven. You see, cultural convention does not matter in light of divine decree. Cultural convention does not matter in light of divine decree. And we've seen that even in our own country recently, if we take to heart what this means here. God's plan is not dependent upon popular opinion. God's plan is dependent solely upon his greatness. Look at verse 24. When her days to give birth were completed, behold, there were twins in her womb. So the day came for Rebekah to give birth, and sure enough, God was right. She had 2 babies inside of her. And I love how that word behold is just dropped in the middle of the verse there. You know, it's to draw your attention that God's word really came true. You know, it's to say, when her days to give birth were completed, behold, check this out. God knew what he was talking about the whole time. There actually were twins in her womb. You know, sometimes God directs us down a certain path, and it may not make much sense on the front end. We may think that can't be true. That surely that's not what God was talking about. But then we come to realize that God knew the entire time what he was doing. Rebekah hears from God and now sees with her eyes the fulfillment of the words of God. Her faith is solidified by God's fulfilled promise. Verse 25, we meet the first twin. It says, the first came out red, all his body like a hairy cloak. So they called his name Esau. So the first of the twins comes out, and he's got red complexion and so much hair, it looks like he's wearing a hairy cloak when he is born. And his name comes from the way that he looked, specifically in relation to all the hair that he had. So you guys who have excessive body hair, this is your patron saint right here. He had a great red complexion, and that coloring red is going to become very important in the story in a few moments, because the word for red is Edom, and that becomes Esau's nickname, though for another reason, as we'll find out. So Esau is named by his parents according to how they saw him. Esau, hairy, that's what they called him. His appearance would forever be thought of every time somebody mentions his name. It was associated with how he looked. How would you like your name that people called you to be associated with some sort of personal trait that you had, whether it was how you looked, part of your personality, who you were, however it was. They're calling in their sons for dinner one night, and they call in the hairy one and the other one, as we're going to find out what his name means in a minute. It's these parents and how they name their kids are very interesting. I don't know if you flipped through baby books when you had kids. I'm sure you did. They are very entertaining, as you can flip through there and see what all the names mean or what they suggest names mean. Well, they didn't do that back then. They said, well, he looks hairy. Let's call him Harry. And that's what they did. Look at verse 26. We meet the second twin. It says, afterward, his brother came out with his hand holding Esau's heel. So his name was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. Now, we learned several things from this verse. First off, how many of you who are 60 would like to have kids today? But anyway, we learned that Isaac was 60 when he had these kids. And we learned back in verse 20, Isaac was 40 when he got married. So he was not able to have children with his wife for 20 years. And he prayed, and God answered his prayer. But we also learned here, Esau's brother was born grabbing a hold of Esau's heel. So literally, he was riding his brother's coattails from the moment they were born. And Esau got his name because he was hairy, and Jacob gets his name because he's holding on to his brother's heel. On the surface, that doesn't seem like that big of a deal, heel grabber. But there's more to that phrase if we examine it a little bit. The idea of a heel grabber is someone who draws close and deceives. It's the idea of deception, betrayal, opportunism. So Jacob, he is named for something he did as a baby and was beyond his control, grabbing his brother's heel. He would be known as betrayer from then on. When they said, Jacob, they were saying, betrayer, come to dinner. So they would call their kids Esau and Jacob, old Harry and betrayer. Let's have a meal together here. So whenever somebody says his name, Jacob, he's reminded of how his parents labeled him as a betrayer from the moment he was born. But little did his parents know how that would go to characterize him in the future. He would live up to that label they placed on him. You know, many times in our lives, we can be hamstrung in our effectiveness on a subconscious level because of labels other people have placed on us. We can be limited by others based upon something that was completely beyond our control. Our effectiveness may be limited in the eyes of others by their opinions, but in the eyes of God, our potential usefulness never expires. Jacob's parents were going to cause problems down the road in Jacob's actions, but God was not done with Jacob yet, just because he had been labeled a betrayer so early. Look at verses 27 and 28. It says, when the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man, dwelling in tents. Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Now we get a glimpse at the family dynamic of this great patriarch, Isaac. He had these twin boys who could not be more different. Now, when I was growing up in Houston, I had a couple of friends who were twins who could not have been more different. One was named Joe, one was named Chris. Joe was very fair complected. He was red hair, and he was very fiery. And Chris, his twin, was very dark complected. He had dark hair. They looked nothing alike. You would have thought that there was some joke at the hospital, these two guys being twins. But they were twins. Their personalities were very different. Joe was a very hard worker. I mean, not to say Chris wasn't, but Joe was a woodworker. He was a carpenter, and which you would imagine is an interesting line of work in today's day and time. But we need carpenters, and Joe would do that. He was very hard at doing woodwork. We actually have a little baby rocking chair in our house that he built. He is very gifted. But Chris, on the flip side, is very business-minded. He's not one to get out there with Joe and work with his hands. He can, but he just does different things. And that's what we have with these two boys here, Esau and Jacob. Completely different personalities, completely different in the way that they live. They may have been born minutes apart, raised in the same household, but they were totally different. Esau is very outdoorsy. He's incredibly talented in hunting animals, while Jacob, he's not as boisterous as Esau. He tended to stay home more than Esau did. And in the same way, Isaac favors the son who hunted and who brought him good food, which, if you notice in that verse, it says that, verse 28, that Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. So we get a definition of why Isaac loved Esau, because Esau brought good food. So it wasn't necessarily, or didn't seem necessarily, that Isaac simply favored Esau just because he did. He favored Esau because Esau brought good food. And so Isaac was being guided by his stomach there in loving one son over the other. And then we get Rebekah showing favoritism towards the other son, Jacob, the betrayer. She may have liked him because he stayed closer to home for longer periods than Esau did. But she also probably remembers that God told her Jacob would be greater. God had promised her father-in-law, Abraham, that the salvation of the world would come through her descendants. And now God told her that Jacob was the one who would be the more powerful nation. It was from Jacob whom the blessing would come upon the earth. So she leans a little bit more towards him. But what even now the parents still don't realize is that preference is a deep-rooted thing. It is far more damaging than they anticipate. You know, preference can seriously delay the things of God. One parent liking one, the other parent liking the other child. Jacob's parents not only messed him up by calling him a betrayer, now they are causing psychological damage by showing favoritism. Look at the next two verses, 29 and 30. Once, when Jacob was cooking stew, Esau came in from the field, and he was exhausted. And Esau said to Jacob, "Let me eat some of that red stew, for I am exhausted." Therefore, his name was called Edom. So one day, the boys had grown up a little bit. Jacob is in their home. He's cooking some stew. Esau's been out at the field. He's probably working hard, possibly hunting for an extended period of time. And he comes home exhausted, very hungry. Remember, his father is stirred by the motivations of his stomach. And now Esau, we find, is very similar to his father. Esau comes in, demands to have some of the stew that Jacob is cooking. Understand that they would have been raised with a faith in God, the knowledge that God's going to bring the salvation of the world through one of their family lines. And in that culture, Esau being the oldest, he would have been granted the largest inheritance, the greatest blessing from their father. And Jacob, quite possibly, could have been jealous of this. And he sees Esau come in begging for food, and Jacob, whose name means betrayer, opportunist, sees an opportunity in Esau's weakness. And so Esau makes a tragic mistake here. And his family line would forever be known by this mistake. He's asking for this red stew. And the word for red, Edom, is what they are going to be called from then on, the Edomites. It's a remembrance of this moment. Esau demanding the red stew and making a trade for it. Verse 31. Jacob said, "Sell me your birthright now." So Jacob makes this big demand of Esau. He wanted the favored position of his father for his own gain. Jacob wanted the birthright, which in his mind included the blessing that his father was going to bestow along with it. The birthright was legally Esau's to keep, to sell, to not do anything with. And Jacob takes advantage of his brother's weakened state in his exhaustion and hunger. And in the end, Jacob lives up to the unfair label that his parents gave him, betrayer. He lives up to his name. They gave him that name. What else could he become? That reminds me of a joke I heard on a sitcom in the 90s. Didn't y'all remember the comedian Sinbad? The joke went, his parents named him Sinbad. He either could have been a pirate or a comedian. And that's what we have here with Jacob. What else could he be when his parents call him a betrayer? He's going to be a betrayer. They're calling him betrayer day in, day out. Every single day they're calling him betrayer. And so this moment of betrayal that he does on his brothers almost seems inevitable. Jacob, he still has a choice to accept the negative label or to turn to God. And in this instance, he did not choose God. He takes advantage of the situation in order to cheat his own brother. Look at verses 32 and 33. Esau said, "I am about to die. Of what use is a birthright to me?" Jacob said, "Swear to me now." So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Now what we see in Esau is he is exaggerating his predicament. In doing so, he devalues his birthright and the blessing. Esau takes a victim mentality here. He is judging his current situation as though it is the worst situation anyone has ever faced. That if he doesn't get some of that red stew in his mouth right now, he will die. Obviously, that was not the case, but he was making it out to be that way. Do you know anybody like this who their current situation is always the worst situation anyone has ever faced in the history of humanity? Or any of you like that whenever something bad happens or something difficult arises, it is the worst thing that has ever happened. And if the historians wrote about it, you would get a big heading in the history books about how bad your life is right now. That's how Esau is presenting himself. He misrepresents his life in this moment, and that causes him to miss out on something. In selling his birthright, selling the blessing, he is missing out on something. Jacob hears of Esau's willingness, and his eyes gleam with wickedness. He demands that Esau swear to what he said. That's like saying, "Give it to me in writing." as we would say today. Esau he swears by it. He gives away his birthright. He gives away his blessing, and is acting as though it doesn't matter to him whatsoever. Look at verse 34. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. Now, I find this verse incredibly interesting. We find out here the kind of stew Jacob has been making. And we find out that Esau traded his birthright for a bowl of bean soup. Now, I don't know about the kind of bean soup that y'all have had before. Bean soup is good. Don't get me wrong. Bean soup is all right. And maybe Jacob's bean soup is like something you would see on the Food Network that you just salivate even thinking about. But it's still bean soup that he is making, and Esau trades his birthright for. It's beans for the birthright. Esau is lusting after these beans in this bean soup. In our own lives, there are things that are supposed to be truly valued, like Esau should have valued his birthright. Things like a relationship with God, our family, our integrity, our representation of Christ in how we live out. But we also have things in our life that are similar to bean soup, things that really aren't all that valuable. Things like other people's opinions of us, or always having to be right, or thinking we are smarter and wiser than we really are. Even being easily offended, that's not something that should take a place in our life. More things that are bean soup, more things that are cultural, things like Facebook, social media, Twitter, Instagram, TV, sports, Netflix, food, money. All of those things at times, depending on the time of day or our attitude, can become valuable in the way we act. But the thing is, favoring beans over your birthright is substituting your average for God's best. God had a best plan, God's greatest opportunity in his blessing. And Esau, not saying Esau would have received the blessing. Obviously, God had already prophesied he would not get it because God knew Esau was going to reject it. And so he traded what could have been the greatest God had to offer for a bowl of bean soup. Anytime we place our preference for the lesser things in place of the greater things, we devalue God's best in our lives. And no matter how magic these beans were, they are nothing when truly compared to the greatness of the birthright given by God himself. Go into chapter 26. We're going to look a little bit into chapter 26 because you may look at Jacob. Obviously, we know what ends up happening with Jacob, but here he looks like a terrible person. He's betrayed his brother. He has done this awful, awful thing in taking advantage of his own flesh and blood. But that doesn't mean God is done with him yet. Verses 1 and 2, Genesis 26. Says, now there was a famine in the land, besides the former famine that was in the days of Abraham. And Isaac went to Gerar to Abimelech, king of the Philistines. And the Lord appeared to him and said, do not go down to Egypt. Dwell in the land which I shall tell you. This is, we see here a famine strikes with devastating fashion, internal struggles that are going on in Isaac's household. He may not even be aware of at this point, but there's a greater national struggle going on, great famine in the area. So Isaac packs up his family and heads to a place that offers better provision for his family with the Philistines of all people. And even though in the future there'll be great animosity between the Philistines and the Israelites, at this point they're almost on friendly terms here. But then God shows up and he gives Isaac some specific instructions. He tells him not to go all the way down to Egypt and totally avoid the famine, totally avoid the difficulty and the struggle. Isaac is supposed to keep his family and stay where God has told him to stay. And in doing so, he would have to rely on God's deliverance, on God's rescue of him from the circumstances. Not so much on his own ingenuity in solving his problems, but on God's hand of blessing in bringing him through. Look at verse 3. God continues telling Isaac what to do. He says, "Sojourn in this land, and I will be with you, and will bless you. For to you and to your offspring I will give all these lands, and I will establish the oath that I swore to Abraham your father." So Isaac is told by God not just to remain in the land, but to sojourn in the land. We learn later on in Hebrews 11 what this means. He's telling them that land that I am giving you isn't your permanent home. That's why he tells them to sojourn, to continue to move, because it's not where they are going to be permanently residing. Anyone who continues to follow God, and how that translates for us today, God's continued plan through Jesus, will have a permanent home in heaven. That's what the author of Hebrews tells us in Hebrews 11, 13 through 16. We live in this world, but it is not our home. Our home is elsewhere. And we will one day step into our homeland, and what a great day that will be. But for Isaac's descendants, in their immediate future, all of that land God's going to give them as a temporary place to live. And it will be theirs because of the promise that God made to Abraham years earlier, far before Isaac's birth. And that promise will be fulfilled one day through Isaac's current children, or more specifically, one of his current children. Look at verses 4 and 5. God promises here. He says, "I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and will give to your offspring all these lands. And in your offspring all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws." So here God restates his promise. Isaac will be given innumerable descendants. And it will be through these descendants that the blessing will be poured out on all the people of the world. This blessing is realized in the coming of Jesus many years later. Jesus, God's Son, who came and who died and who rose from the dead, giving us the free opportunity to go to heaven if we would simply believe. And this is the blessing that God is speaking of for the entire world here. And anyone who would believe gets the blessing of heaven. But what is really fascinating about this in terms of the life of Isaac and his kids is that God has already told Rebekah that Jacob will be the one who, through whose descendants the blessing will come. And we just found out a minute ago how deceitful and evil the heart of Jacob really is. He cheats his brother in the way he does, betrays his brother. And yet God is still going to use him. God is still going to train up this future man of faith, even though he is not displaying that faith now. God, even though we may do things in our lives that that make us undeserving of God's blessing, God does not have a never to be used again shelf that you can get placed upon. You do something here on earth, God's not going to take you and put you up on a shelf and say, "That's where I put people I never use ever again." Because we're all sinners. We all sin. We all make mistakes. And God still chooses to use us anyway. If you're still alive on this planet, God still has a purpose for you. He's not going to remove you until He's done using you here. You see, no matter what we've done in our past, or even what we're doing right now, if we're willing to follow God, we will still be able to be used by Him to accomplish His purposes. God is not going to leave you struggling in the muck and the mire. If you reach out your hand to Him, He is going to grasp it and pull you out. Your past, no matter how dark, cannot dictate terms to the future that God intends for the willing. Your past cannot overpower God's intent for your future. You cannot alter your past, but you can bring your past to the altar and let God have control of your life. Is there something in your life that's been holding you back? Maybe a temptation or a secret sin or somebody else's perception or somebody else's opinion of you or about your life. Maybe it's how you view yourself. Do you need to let go of those things and embrace God's loving plan for your life, for your future, to be fully used by Him to accomplish His glory in your life? Are you craving the bean soup over the value of the birthright. We need to examine our lives and see what are the things that are truly bean soup, the things that are not really all that valuable. And then what are the things that are truly valuable, the eternal things, the things that will never end. What are those birthright things? And we need to stop trading beans for the birthright and start living like we really are the children of God, called to inherit the heaven that He created back when He created everything. But you also need to ask yourself, before you can inherit the birthright, you have to believe in Jesus. Do you need to believe in Jesus today? Believing that He sent His Son, or God sent His Son Jesus to come to die in your place so that your destination of pain and punishment is changed to heaven forever. And nothing you do now can ever undo what Jesus did on the cross. It's already been done. It's already been paid for. And you can't earn heaven because it's already been earned if you would simply receive it and believe that Jesus did that, died and rose on your behalf. And so in a moment, I'm going to pray. And you're going to have an opportunity to investigate your own spiritual well-being. Is there something that is that bean soup you've got to let go of? Is there something in your past that really has been holding on to your psyche and is preventing you from being usable for God? Is there a step you need to take today and believe in Jesus for the first time? Then now is the time. When I pray, when I say amen, that is your opportunity to do business, to either step out, come down and talk to me, and we'll take care of you getting your reservation settled in heaven today. If you need to come and pray at the altar, we would love for you to come and do that. Bring your past to the altar and see what God can do with your future.